Dionysus is slaughtered and then restored to glory again and again for eternity, a mystery play of eternal encore. This eternal cycle of death and rebirth is motivated by what Nietzsche identifies as the will to might, or the will to power. I will have much more to say on this in later videos, but for now it is sufficient to say that Nietzsche, following Schopenhauer, proposed that reality in itself is best characterized as an eternal striving. Behind all events, processes, and beings lies the same principle of existence, the same essential drama, albeit in infinitely varied masks, the drama of Dionysus. But this drama is itself only the libretto of the eternal opera of existence. The music of this opera is the will to might, and the name of the opera is the eternal recurrence. The will to might, that is, the principle of life and existence, strives after its own death and resurrection, its own eternal recurrence. The personification or avatar or symbol of this will is Dionysus, who is also called the crucified. The prophet of this god and of this will is Nietzsche's Zarathustra. What we call pain, suffering, injustice, cruelty, sin, agony are eternal, inescapable aspects of existence. In terms of their form, they are the necessary counterparts of the good, the systole to life's diastole. As to their content, they are etched forever into eternal history, as into a great pyramidal block of stone, which we pass by again and again on our loop about a wooded lake. Events have happened. Nothing can make them unhappen. To bear this reality as the only reality, a reality of eternal joy and eternal suffering, if you like, a marriage with no possibility of divorce, that requires that one affirms, that one finds justification for even the greatest horrors and atrocities, crying, "Yes, even this shall be. Even this, for me, is necessary." We shall see later that this does not mean one is undiscerning or without taste. Nietzsche believes in both a holy yes and a holy no, but this no is, in a paradoxical way itself, still a kind of yes. Again, we'll get into that much more later. The effective conclusion of "Thus Spake Zarathustra" records Zarathustra saying, quote, "Oh, how could I not amorous be of eternity, and of the nuptial ring of rings, the ring of reoccurring? Never yet found I the woman of whom I desired children, save this woman whom I love. For I love thee, O eternity, for I love thee, O eternity." Unquote. We are now better prepared to understand one of the more controversial aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy, his attack on the virtue of Mitleid. Kaufmann translates this word as pity, and that is the translation I will most often use. However, it can just as well be translated as compassion or sympathy. The latter is probably closer, at least in structure, to Mitleid. Mit means with, and leid means woe, grief, suffering. Hence, Mitleid is shared suffering, with suffering. You feel sorry for someone, and you mourn for their lot secondhand. Perhaps Nietzsche does not baffle and offend his readers more than when he attacks Mitleid, and perhaps here, more than anywhere else, I myself am most at odds with Nietzsche. I'll say it clear, I think that in the end, Nietzsche is wrong about Mitleid. But my disagreement with him is not superficial. I think that Nietzsche, by questioning what nobody else thought questionable, discovered insights unobtainable in any other way. In a dark valley, Nietzsche hewed the exposed rock, and mined a hard and heavy ore, and with handmade bellows he smelted it, and forged from flames as hot as heaven a terrible sword, with which he could slay a terrible dragon threatening his land. Many have tried to rediscover this forge, but got lost in the Black Mountains or took a false step and fell to their deaths. Only after several years of exploration and mountaineering, I think I have created a mostly safe pathway, winding down into that mysterious valley and to his cold and crumbling forge. I should like to show you the way, for I have made use of that same bellows and the notes that he left behind to begin forging my own sword. It is a very different sword from Nietzsche's, and I think much improved upon Nietzsche's design, but it is impossible without his original innovations, and it is still patterned somewhat after its workmanship. I expect that, someday, I shall have to challenge him to a duel with my sword. Indeed, perhaps that is the only way I shall be able to fetch my Virgil back from the underworld. I begin with some quotations from an unfinished manuscript of Nietzsche's, the first draft for a book on the pre-Socratic philosophers called Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks. Essential Salts, the fellow behind the Nietzsche podcast, is currently doing a thorough review of the same thing, of that whole book. I'll put a link in the description below. But what I want to focus on is Nietzsche's remarkably insightful analysis, I think, of the pre-Socratic philosopher Anaximander, the student of the first philosopher, Thales. We have only one direct quotation from Anaximander which has reached us from antiquity, and which Nietzsche renders thus, quote, Anaximander says upon one occasion, quote, where the source of things is, to that place they must also pass away, according to necessity, for they must pay penance and be judged for their injustices in accordance with the ordinance of time, unquote, unquote. It is generally understood that Anaximander is using moral imagery to talk about cosmic processes, but Nietzsche takes this a step further in claiming that Anaximander is infusing metaphysics with morality. The ideal state, the most just state, is a state of perfect equilibrium, where everything is balanced against everything else, and consequently, nothing ever happens. Everything is peace and tranquility. The only reason that anything ever happens is because there are imbalances, injustices. There is, for instance, more energy over here than over there, and such an imbalance necessitates compensation, which in turn causes more disturbances and inequalities, etc., back and forth, around and around, like a swinging pendulum. In order for anything to ever happen, there must develop an inequality, an imbalance, a strain and stress, crying out for relief, a desire, a willing, an itch. Galaxies would not have developed without original inequalities in the distribution of matter. We would have no weather if there were no imbalances in air pressure, which are in turn caused by imbalances of sunlight, which are caused by the rotation of the Earth relative to the Sun, as well as by its tilt and revolution. Life is suffering because life is itself imbalance. It is an endless striving after equilibrium, after sleep, rest, death. Again, Nietzsche quotes from Schopenhauer, quote, the proper measure with which to judge any and all human beings is that they are really creatures who should not exist at all, and who are doing penance for their lives by their manifold sufferings and their death. What could we expect of such creatures? Are we not all sinners under sentence of death? We do penance for having been born, first by living and then by dying, unquote. Nietzsche goes on to say, quote, "It may not be logical, but it certainly is human to view now, together with Anaximander, all coming to be as though it were an illegitimate emancipation from eternal being, a wrong for which destruction is the only penance," unquote. Furthermore, he imagines Anaximander himself as saying, quote, "What is your existence worth? And if it is worthless, why are you here? Your guilt, I see, causes you to tarry in your existence. With your death, you have to expiate it. Look how your earth is withering, how your seas are diminishing and drying up. The seashell on the mountaintop can show you how much has dried up already. Even now, fire is destroying your world. Someday it will go up in fumes and smoke. But ever and anew, another such world of ephemerality will construct itself. Who is there that could redeem you from the curse of coming to be?" Unquote. Here we have the first cries of nihilism, that it is better not to be than to be. It is but a step further to say, it is wrong that things exist. It is wrong that I exist. I must atone for my own existence. What, Nietzsche asks, could possibly induce someone to say such a thing, much less make a philosophy out of it? The answer, Nietzsche says, is Mitleid, that is, pity, compassion, sympathy. Nietzsche's mentor, Arthur Schopenhauer, condemned the universe for being an eternal maelstrom of suffering and claimed that the foundation of morality was pity for other suffering creatures. When one sees existence aright, one is filled with pity and concludes from this that it would be better if none of it existed at all. In an infamous passage, Schopenhauer illustrates just what depths of horror and moral terror he has in mind. Quote, Junghalm, who was a researcher at the time, relates that he saw in Java a plain far as the eye could reach entirely covered with skeletons, and took it for a battlefield. They were, however, merely the skeletons of large turtles, 5 feet long and 3 feet broad, and the same height, which come this way out of the sea in order to lay their eggs, and are then attacked by wild dogs, who with their united strength lay them on their backs, strip off their lower armor, that is, the small shell of the stomach, and so devour them alive. But often then a tiger pounces upon the dogs. Now all this misery repeats itself thousands and thousands of times, year out, year in. For this, then, these turtles are born. Unquote. The problem of evil is not just a human problem. It is a problem of animal suffering, perhaps even plant suffering. Who knows how far down suffering really goes? But, says Nietzsche, it is unrestrained pity for this suffering that seduces us towards nihilism, towards hatred of the world. In response, many people take their anger out upon God by doing him the disservice of denying his existence, or perhaps they do him the service of denying his existence because they find this preferable to accepting that their beloved Heavenly Father could ever be complicit in such atrocities. That's me playing psychoanalyst, but in any case. Thus, the problem of evil is traditionally posed as a challenge to God's existence. But both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche perceived that the problem of evil has much deeper roots than this. In Dostoevsky's last novel, The Brothers Karamazov, the character of Ivan Karamazov admits that it is not really God that he takes issue with, but existence itself, He wants, as it were, to refund his ticket of admission. Quote, I don't want harmony. From love of humanity, I don't want it. Too high a price is asked for harmony. It's beyond our means to pay so much to enter on it. And so I hasten to give back my entrance ticket, and if I am an honest man, I am bound to give it back as soon as possible, and that I am doing. It's not God that I don't accept, only I most respectfully return him the ticket. Tell me yourself, I challenge your answer. Imagine that you are creating a fabric of human destiny with the object of making men happy in the end, giving them peace and rest at last, but that it was essential and inevitable to torture to death only one tiny creature, and you found that edifice on its unavenged tears. Would you consent to be the architect on those conditions? Tell me, and tell the truth." Unquote. What motivates Ivan Karamazov here? Pity or compassion for his fellow beings. I myself am especially sensitive to children crying. On many occasions I have heard a child cry, and I have seriously wondered, not for very long, but for a moment, whether existence itself is really worth it. When that little child is crying, "Mommy, where's my mommy?" Someday I intend to write a novel where the lead character is a man made unstable by trauma who is capable of killing 5 men because he heard one child weeping. And this, I think, is something such a character would have to overcome. For Nietzsche, pity is the bloom of nihilistic mycorrhizae. It is pity which says, on behalf of the sufferer, no, this is too terrible. This cannot be justified. This should not be. Pity thus becomes the advocate of nihilism, of annihilation. Nietzsche, however, takes the side of life and seeks to justify it through the symbol of Dionysus. The drama of Dionysus, the drama of suffering continually overcome, is the drama of will to might, which plays out at every level of existence, from the atom to the amoeba to the animals and the asteroids. That's at least how I interpret Nietzsche. To deny suffering, even the most exquisite suffering, is therefore to deny the conditions for existence itself. It is written in Matthew's Gospel, quote, "From that time forth began Jesus to show unto his disciples how that he must go unto Jerusalem, and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised again the 3rd day. Then Peter took him, and began to rebuke him, saying, Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee. But he turned, and said unto Peter, Get thee behind me, Satan. Thou art an offense unto me, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men." Unquote. One of my disagreements with René Girard is that, if I understand him correctly, he posits the sacrifice of Christ as a kind of instructive satire of sacrifice, the aim of which is to end sacrifice. Girard notes that all human cooperations and corporations, that is, institutions, infrastructures, it's all founded upon the sacrifice of a scapegoat. The scapegoat is painted as morally blameworthy and thus deserving of death. The community kills them, and in this way forges deep social bonds with each other, like a gang initiation or a pivotal battle in a nation's history. Girard judges this to be an awful, evil thing. So, God sent Christ, a perfectly innocent man, to play the role of a scapegoat. Christ was killed, But because his innocence was so obvious, it revealed the true nature of scapegoat sacrifices. The victim is no eviler than anyone else, and thus no more deserving of death. Christ's sacrifice demonstrates how the whole enterprise is fraudulent, unjust, and unjustifiable. What follows from this revelation? The creeping collapse of human cooperation per se, for sacrifice ceases to have its unconscious sociological power once its true nature is made conscious. Greater and greater sacrifices are required in order to induce social cohesion. Again, if I understand Girard correctly, this is all intended to produce a crisis in humanity. They must either give up scapegoating and embrace a different method of organization, universal charity, or they must make all of humanity into its own scapegoat via self-annihilation. Note that in either case, humanity accepts its fundamental guilt, that the basis of all human society is a terrible evil practice, the founding murder. Someone got the short end of the stick. And out of pity for them, the whole enterprise comes into question. The very foundation for human flourishing is murder and exploitation. Humanity as such is born in sin. But much more importantly, I think, Girard's view misunderstands the point of the atonement. In fact, I think it misunderstands it in a way that Nietzsche would say is characteristically, quote, Christian. Girard, like Peter, seems to be saying that Jesus' suffering is not metaphysically necessary. Sacrifice is not a part of God's intended creation. It was, in fact, to prove this fact that Jesus was sacrificed. If this is a valid inference from Girard's philosophy, then I do not agree. Existence is built upon sacrifice. To remove sacrifice from existence is like removing inconvenience from pregnancy or pain from birth. But sympathy or pity for the pain of childbirth, if unrestrained, would get rid of childbirth itself. Pity, to end suffering, would end existence. This, I think, is the kernel of Nietzsche's contention. There are, I believe, by the way, very interesting parallels here with the philosophy of Karl Marx. Marx endeavored to show that the foundations of capitalist society, and in fact, the foundations of all society since the dawn of civilization, have been the exploitation of workers' labor in order to generate a surplus at the disposal of the ruling class. This surplus is what enables man to ascend from caves and campfires to cities and skyscrapers, from mere subsistence and equilibrium to ambition, profit, and growth. All of this is founded upon the exploitation of the worker. The employer garners a percentage from the laborers, accumulating a surplus which he may use to do things impossible under mere subsistence living. Surplus is the catalyst of civilization and progress, but it can only be gotten through the exploitation of the worker. They are not paid back in full. A greater and greater disparity thus builds between workers and employers, and this debt cries out for payment, even if it be through the employer's spilt blood. In both Girard and Marx, far more care and attention seems to be given to critiquing human organization than to painting a picture of redeemed humanity. One wonders whether we would not benefit more from a clear exemplar of utopian life, so we might begin to mimic it. Surely it would be instructive to see just how exactly humanity is to get along without sacrifice and exploitation. For if humanity cannot get along without it, should humanity be destroyed? Maybe so, but what if life itself cannot get along without it? Should life itself be destroyed too? One of the most haunting passages in Nietzsche, and one of the more controversial, is from section 259 of Beyond Good and Evil. Quote, refraining mutually from injury, violence, and exploitation, and placing one's will on a par with that of someone else, this may become, in a certain rough sense, good manners among individuals if the appropriate conditions are present, namely, if these men are actually similar in strength and value standards and belong together in one body. But as soon as this principle is extended, and possibly even accepted as the fundamental principle of society, it immediately proves to be what it really is, a will to the denial of life, a principle of disintegration and decay. Here we must beware of superficiality and get to the bottom of the matter, resisting all sentimental weakness. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, overpowering of what is alien and weaker, suppression, hardness, imposition of one's own forms, incorporation, and, at least at its mildest, exploitation. But why should one always use those words in which a slanderous intent has been imprinted for ages? A living and not a dying body has to do to other bodies what the individuals within it refrain from doing to each other. It will have to be an incarnate will to power. It will strive to grow, spread, seize, become predominant, not from any morality or immorality, but because it is living, and because life simply is will to power. Everywhere people are now raving, even under scientific disguises, about coming conditions of society in which the exploitative aspect will be removed, which sounds to me as if they promised to invent a way of life that would dispense with all organic functions. Exploitation, so called, does not belong to a corrupt or imperfect and primitive society. It belongs to the essence of what lives as a basic organic function. It is a consequence of the will to power, which is, after all, the will to life." Unquote. How are we to make sense of this passage? From Genesis, I quote, "And said Elohim, may the waters teem with swarms of living souls. So made Elohim the great sea serpents, and every living soul that can move, which filled the waters, each after its kind. And Elohim beheld that it was good." Unquote. Nothing can live without eating. Animals eat other animals, or they eat plants. Plants soak up sunlight, but are also fertilized with the dung and corpses of dead animals. Life is that which eats. In other words, life is that which appropriates, absorbs, dominates. Nothing can live without exploiting other living things in this way. Multicellular life depends upon the sacrifice of its component cells for the sake of the collective. We ourselves are colonies of some 30 trillion cells. Why do these cells stick together? Why don't they dissipate or rebel? Why isn't cancer the norm? How is this tremendous organization possible? Nietzsche, at least I think, would argue that this is not a matter of social contracts or democracy. The cells are held in thrall by a higher power which presumably has emerged out of the evolutionary process and is represented by the whole organism. Our bodies are the result of countless victories and conquests upon less powerful opponents. Our bodies are empires, and they are held together by power. Without power and the exercise of power, of dominion, of rulership, of imposition, of force. Without these, Nietzsche says, life could never progress past single-celled organisms, if that. Nietzsche calls Christianity a religion of pity, in fact, the religion of pity, and pity, Nietzsche says, advocates against the conditions needed for any structure to rise above the ground level, since this would require exploitation of the foundation. This, I think, is why Nietzsche says that Christianity and anarchism are the same. Both resent anything that dares raise itself out of the primordial soup, and uses pity to justify this resentment. If I understand Nietzsche correctly, his point is that nothing greater than an atom or a cell arose without the exercise of power to dominate, conquer, incorporate, and lead. To reject this principle, the principle of power, is to reject life and even existence itself. One thenceforth desires to raise all superstructures, all such tyrannies, everything greater than the single cell or atom, if even that, raise it to the ground level, to reduce everything back to atoms, to destroy all government and authority and power, and loose upon the world mere anarchy, come what may, for better or worse. I'm actually going to read a quotation from Nietzsche. I didn't originally put this in the script, but I think it's worthwhile here, and it's a very good quotation. It gives a good sense of where Nietzsche's headspace is. This is from the notes for Will to Power, section 765. Quote, "One speaks of the profound injustice of the social pact, as if the fact that this man is born in favorable circumstances, that in unfavorable ones, were in itself an injustice, or even that it is unjust that this man should be born with these qualities, that man with those. Among the most honest of these opponents of society, it is asserted, we ourselves, with all our bad, sick, criminal qualities, which we admit to, are only the inescapable consequences of a long suppression of the weak by the strong. They make the ruling classes responsible for their characters, and they threaten, they rage, they curse, they become virtuous from indignation. They do not want to have become bad men for nothing. This pose, an invention of the last few decades, is also called pessimism, as I hear, the pessimism of indignation. Here the claim is made to judge history, to divest it of its fatality, to discover responsibility behind it, guilty men in it. For this is the rub, one needs guilty men. The underprivileged, the decadents of all kinds, are in revolt on account of themselves, and need victims so as not to quench their thirst for destruction by destroying themselves. To this end, they need an appearance of justice, i.e., a theory through which they can shift the responsibility for their existence, for their being thus and thus, onto some sort of scapegoat. This scapegoat can be God. In Russia, there is no lack of such atheists from resentment. Or it could be against the social order, or education and training, or the Jews, or the nobility, or those who have turned out well in any way. It is a crime to be born in favorable circumstances, for thus one has disinherited the others, pushed them aside, condemned them to vice, even to work. How can I help it that I am wretched? But somebody must be responsible, otherwise it would be unbearable. In short, the pessimism of indignation invents responsibility in order to create a pleasant feeling for itself, revenge. Sweeter than honey, old Homer called it. Well, I quote that because I think it neatly puts forth Nietzsche's opinion, which is that pity is weaponized or mobilized by those who want to bring down those who they enviously see as doing better than them, to probably put it in much more tender terms than Nietzsche would, but I'm trying to trying to help my friend out here because I don't agree with many of the implications of some of what he has said, though I do think that's a brilliant passage, depending on where you apply it. I mean, it's a psychological, it's masterful in its psychology. But in any case, life, according to Nietzsche would say life requires exploitation. I prefer to say life requires sacrifice. To reject this out of pity is to reject life, which is itself organizational power. That, by the way, is why Christianity, the religion of pity, according to Nietzsche, brought about the fall of the Roman Empire. That is also why, when the Catholic Church seemed ready to outgrow its roots and become the new Roman Empire, Luther arose, claiming Catholicism was anti-Christian and seeking to destroy the Church's power and authority. The result was a multiplication of sects. Nietzsche clearly believes that socialism and anarchism are the heirs of the zeitgeist he attributes thus to Christianity, and it is precisely by appealing to these Christian instincts of pity and revenge that they are so popular. This is the little history bit about the Catholic Church. That's a very condensed version of what Nietzsche says in The Antichrist. So it's an interesting approach, to say the least. In any case, there are 30 trillion cells in the human body. According to recent estimates, only 116 billion human beings have lived or are currently living upon the planet. What both have in common is that without them, without their sacrifices, intentional or unintentional, you would not exist right now. Everything is built upon sacrifice. We are all enthroned upon the skulls of our ancestors and the blood of our eaten victims. We are able to reach higher because they were not able to. They forewent pleasures so that we could taste more of it. Now, the million-dollar question for Nietzsche here is, were they conscious that this is what they were doing? Was their sacrifice given with full knowledge and consent? This is perhaps precisely where Nietzsche offends us the most, because he answers, usually, no. And certainly this is true for cells and for the animals that we eat, but it is also true for the commodities we buy and for the infrastructure and amenities we enjoy. Who keeps the power on? Who makes our clothes? Who farms our food? Who keeps us safe? I spent the decade of my youth and young adulthood, 11 to 21, in almost daily battle with heavily masked anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorder. For most of that period, I did not have any clear idea of what all of this was for. What was God's purpose here? I was inclined to think it was to improve me, myself. But eventually, in one of the worst pits of anxiety I've ever been in, I realized I needed a better explanation than that. Long story short, I got the explanation. It was so that I could help other people later in my life. This may sound trite, but understand the gravity of it. I was put through hell for 10 years for the sake of another person. Did I consent to this? Well, I actually have some theories of my own about that, but from the material perspective alone, certainly not. And yet, I was able to help them. I was the sacrifice. Through that sacrifice, I was able to help a number of people. Help them, I mean, in a very deep way. And I know that that has been the case with other people for me, that they have, as it were, been sacrificed for me. What is our response to these unintentional sacrifices? For some of them, may have happened many generations ago. Some may be happening right now, but we won't receive the benefit until near the end of our lives. How are we to respond to this suffering? We could respond with pity for the suffering, but what good will that do? The suffering already happened. On the other hand, we could respond with gratitude, for gratitude acknowledges suffering, but does so in order to frame the benefit it created. Pity says, you shouldn't have. Gratitude says, thank you. Gratitude is the sentiment of what we could call the spiritual aristocrat. Pity, that of the spiritual anarchist. The aristocrat experiences themselves as fundamentally worth it. When they hear Christians say, I am not worthy of Christ's sacrifice, they are puzzled and they reply, well, then pass it on to someone who is worthy of it. It's a cruel way to put it, but the spiritual aristocrat feels a sense of purpose, of import to their existence. They feel justified in existing, and in existing in the way that they do. And they thus express gratitude for the sacrifices that made their existence possible and accept them with a good conscience. I feel like I'm failing here, but I think the principle I'm trying to get at, there's a quote from Joseph Smith, and I actually paused this video so I could try to find it, and I can't find it, but it's along the lines of, one of the first things that someone must do in their relationship with God is they need to seek to know that their life is being lived in a way that is indeed pleasing to God. It's like the first step is knowing God exists, and the second step is getting a confirmation from God, a testimony from God that the way that one has arranged one's life is indeed pleasing to Him. And that, I think, is what I'm perceiving here in Nietzsche. Obviously, I am bringing God into it, and Nietzsche does not, but it's the same experience, it's the same feeling of realizing or of knowing I am in a position of justification. And Nietzsche wants it to be a self-justification, and I'm saying that that's a part of it. You do need to know for yourself that it's justified and it's pleasing to you, but you also need to know that it is pleasing to God. So, a Christian and Nietzsche walk into a bar and have this conversation. But that's important. I don't know. This is precisely, I'm going to continue with my script now. This is precisely what we do when we eat. We are grateful for the food, even if the animal did not understand what was happening. And why is this acceptable? Well, because there is an order of rank between humans and animals. The life of a human being is worth more than that of an animal, which is not to say the life of the animal is worth less. Well, it's worth less than the human, I suppose, but it is not without worth. It's actually of tremendous worth, which is a testament to how incredibly important human beings are. But the life of the animal must be subject to the life of the human. We feel this way, like, what about the life of a child compared with that of its parents? Or the life of a dignitary compared with his bodyguard? And people sacrifice their lives for things all the time. The spiritual anarchist, as I'm sort of terming it, Nietzsche does not use that term, but the spiritual anarchist decries this situation effectively and says that the human being must be worth less than the animal if they have to eat the animal in order to survive. They are not powerful in their own right. They are exploiting that which is weaker than them. Their power is wholly derived. So the spiritual anarchist tries to cast shade on the character of anything more complex than the atom in existence. The spiritual anarchist exalts all that is basest, all that is at the bottom, all that is unrefined, unorganized, unappropriated, raw, chaotic material. They try to exalt that to the highest position. That, I think, is what Nietzsche is getting at when he is railing against the basest things rising to the top or being raised up to the top and trying to establish these notions of order of rank. We'll get more into that in later videos, but I wanted to try to touch on it here. There's another quote that I want to give from Nietzsche, and I feel like it's not going to solve anything. If anything, it's probably just going to make things more complex, make the riddle more tightly wound, but I'm going to share it anyway because my goal here is not to sugarcoat Nietzsche, but I want to, and it's not even to reconcile, but in some sense I'm trying, it's an experience of gratitude. I'm trying to turn lead into gold, or better, find the gold hidden in the lead, and I know that it's there. Sometimes Nietzsche doesn't make it easy for me, but that is the spirit in which I'm doing this, and I insist upon that. So this is the quotation. Quote, "The essential characteristic of a good and healthy aristocracy is that it experiences itself not as a function, whether of the monarchy or of the commonwealth, but as their meaning and highest justification, that it therefore accepts with a good conscience the sacrifice of untold human beings, who for its sake must be reduced and lowered to incomplete human beings, to slaves, to instruments. Their fundamental faith simply has to be that society must not exist for society's sake, but only as the foundation and scaffolding on which a choice type of being is able to raise itself to its highest task and to a higher state of being," unquote. Now, I have serious problems with this aspect of Nietzsche, and that's what I mean by eventually I'm going to have to challenge him to a duel. But I cannot do that until I fully understand it. And so that's what I've been trying to do in this video and what I intend to do throughout this commentary. And the point I wanted to make from that is, I would put it this way. This is perhaps the kernel of truth in what Nietzsche is saying. And I think there's actually more of a kernel, as awful as that might sound. You have a body because God deemed you worthy to place at the head of 30 trillion cells who are duty-bound by love of God to sacrifice themselves for your sake. And if you want to apply that to Nietzsche's untold human beings, you can apply that rather neatly if you talk about the 116 billion human beings who have lived on the planet and who lived and died and suffered and sacrificed. And the world is the way that it is now with all of its advancements because of, well, not even with all of its advancements, the world simply continues to be here. And we as human beings are here because of their sacrifice. Nietzsche's being more dramatic than that, but that is one way of trying to reconcile it. It's my way of trying to turn lead into gold, if he will forgive the expression. And it leaves me shuddering, that thought of the 30 trillion cells. I shudder, whether it's with divine gratitude or with a kind of pitying horror I do not yet know.